Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Children are going back to school. From tomorrow, all pupils in England can return to their classrooms. It will be staggered in some places and it won't feel like normal, but many parents and children will still be breathing a big sigh of relief that homeschooling is over. It's also clear, though, that the consequences of months stuck at home will impact this generation of young people for years to come. And from a political point of view, getting children back in the classroom is just the beginning. It's also about catching up on lost learning and making sure exams are fair. Well, today we've got the perfect lineup to talk about schools going back. The Education Secretary Gavin Williamson will be joining us in just a moment. And we'll also be hearing from the Chief Inspector of Schools in England, Spellman. Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary Nandy will be on the show. And ahead of International Women's Day, I've spoken to the Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. And after Nicola Sturgeon gave evidence to the Salmond inquiry, we'll also be talking to the SNP's Mhairi. First, though, ahead of all children in England returning to school tomorrow, we can speak now to the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme, Mr Williamson. Keen, of course, to talk about the return of pupils to the classrooms, but I just want to start on NHS pay, if I may. The government deciding to give nurses a pay rise of just 1%. What is it about the last year that's made the government feel that nurses deserve a pay cut in real terms?
Well, the government has at every stage been clear in terms of our commitment to the NHS. This is why over the last year we've seen an extra £6 billion being invested into the NHS. This is why over the next few years we're going to be seeing an increase of close to £34 billion going into the NHS. And over 1 million NHS staff are going to be receiving pay increases over and above that. But also, we are facing difficult economic challenges. We're facing almost 750,000 people who are unemployed. And we have, in the context of that, decided to exempt the NHS from the public sector pay freeze, which is the only part of the public sector that has been exempted from that.
At the same time, though, nurses are getting a pay rise of 1%. I mean, inflation next year is expected to be 1.5%, so that works out as a pay cut in real terms. I can't help thinking this has got a flavour of Marcus Rashford about it. You know, everyone can see the U-turn coming. Are you just being wheeled out to defend a policy that the government's going to row back on?
Well, over the last few years, we've seen record increases in terms of the pay going to our nurses and our doctors, quite rightly. We are facing... We're effectively facing a much more difficult economic time and economic period. We've seen a shrinking of our economy of 10%. But what this is part of a process, and we've put this forward for nurses and for the NHS. But we are always investing in our NHS. This is why we've had a record investment this year and continued record investment in our National Health Service over the coming years.
The Royal College of Nursing is considering industrial action. Would that be responsible?
Well, what we always want to do is work with all of our partners within the NHS to be able to get to the very best possible place. We've seen the NHS do magnificent work over the last year. We've seen a massive investment in terms of our NHS, but also in terms of tackling COVID.
But on industrial action specifically, would industrial action be responsible?
Well, no one wants to see industrial action. I'm certain the Royal College of Nursing wouldn't want to see industrial action. But the government is completely committed to our investment in the NHS. You've seen that all the way through the pandemic, but you've seen that over the past 10 years, where you've seen record increases in the amount of investment and the amount of money that we've been putting into the NHS. And that isn't just going to be continuing over this year, but it's going to be continuing over subsequent years as well.
OK. At a time when, you're talking about the economic challenges, is it a good look when nurses are facing pay restraint, for example, that the Prime Minister's considering splashing out some money refurbishing the Downing Street flat?
Well, what we all recognise is that it's a period of real making sure that we have sort of restraint right across the public sector, but we aren't nervous about in terms of investing in those key public services such as the NHS, such as schools.
And investing in Downing Street makeover as well, then.
But, I'm like you, Sophie, probably more interested, more fascinated about making sure children get back to school tomorrow. And I know from my perspective as a dad, that's certainly what I'm wanting to see, and I'm sure what many of your viewers are wanting to see as well.
OK, well, let's move on to school, shall we? Do teachers deserve a pay rise?
Well, we saw this year the largest pay increase for teachers since 2005, but there is going to be pay restraint. There is going to be a pay freeze for the coming year, but we are continuing to invest in schools. We're continuing to invest in schools right across the country, making sure some of the lowest funded schools get extra increases, and this gives schools the resources in order to be able to support children as they return back to school. But we are facing, a tough economic time. That's why this year there will be a pay. For coming year there will be a pay freeze. But for this year that we're entering into, of course, teachers are seeing the largest increase since 2005.
OK. Now, of course, as you mentioned, schools going back tomorrow, or people return to the classrooms tomorrow. Big day for so many pupils and parents across the country. In secondary schools, pupils and staff will be asked to wear face masks. How is this going to be enforced?
Well, what we saw in September, we asked all children to be wearing face masks in communal areas where there are national restrictions, which increasingly covered and ended up covering the whole of the country. And what we saw during that period, there's an incredibly large number of pupils that followed the rules, that were supported in following the rules by teachers and members of staff, and it worked very, very well. And I think pupils recognise the importance of doing whatever they can do, not just to protect themselves, but to protect their friends and the whole school community, as well as their families and the wider community.
At the same time, it's quite different, though, isn't it? Asking children to wear face masks all day in the classroom rather than just in communal areas. And it sounds from your answer that there's not really anything that you're doing other than asking pupils to do it. In primary schools as well, teachers are just supposed to wear masks where possible. I'm really not sure what that even means. I mean, it sounds a little bit like you're saying this is too difficult for us to work out. We're just going to leave it to the teachers. You just sort it out yourselves.
Not at all. What we've done is we set up very clear guidance as to how teachers are best be able to approach this. And it's actually informed by Public Health England and their best advice as to how best to approach this and reduce transmission. But wearing a face mask is just one small element of all the protections that we put in place. It's whether it is the distancing, whether it's bubbling, whether it's keeping year groups together and smaller groups together, whether it's the staggered sort of home times and sort of welcoming to school times. All of these measures go towards reducing COVID. And what we saw between September and Christmas is incredibly successful in reducing the number of instances in COVID in schools. Only 0.2% of pupils had confirmed COVID during that time. So it goes to show it works. But we're adding these extra layers of protection, not just for masks, but also the testing, really to be able to support schools and help them. But it's not just one single thing. It's many, many things that schools are doing to be able to protect pupils and protect staff.
Of course, another way that you could reduce COVID transmission in schools would be through vaccinations. Would you like to see people under the age of 18 be eligible for vaccinations?
Yeah. Well, this has got to be absolutely informed by the best scientific and medical advice. And as you're aware, there currently isn't a vaccine that's available for those who are under 16 and only one available for those under 18. So we've really got to see the research of the trials, and we've got to look to the best medical and scientific advice that will be provided by the JCVI, who are the independent experts who are advising government on this. But when we look at vaccinations, I mean, the fact that we're rolling this out so incredibly rapidly, the fact that the number of doses that are going to be available to the NHS is going to be increasing from 2 million to 4 million a week, really goes to show the transformative progress that we're making. And the fact that this is what is going to help us unlock the whole of the country. And we look to next week, and I think the whole nation looks to next week with some real excitement, because we're looking towards next week, and it's the nation's first step out of lockdown, the first step towards this process of recovery and getting everyone back to the lives that we had just over a year ago.
You say there's going to be a process of recovery, and there clearly will have to be, a pretty substantial process of recovery to help children, particularly disadvantaged children, recover from a year of disrupted education. You've got a review going on into seeing how best pupils can catch up. One of the things that you've said it's right to have a discussion about is shortening that summer holiday and potentially moving to a 5-term year. Is that something that you're seriously considering?
Well, it's a whole range of different sort of proposals that we're looking at, whether it's a 5-term year, whether it's lengthening the school day, but also measures such as enhancing the support that we give to teachers, supporting them in their professional development, making sure they can be actually the very best of themselves. It's looking at different measures.
Specifically on the holidays, is that something that is seriously on the table? It could happen.
Well, we're looking at holidays, we're looking at lengthening the school day, we're looking at a whole range of measures. And we've asked Sir Kevin Collins to leave no stone unturned. For us, we see this as one of those moments, a little bit like the 1944 Education Reform Act that came out of the Second World War, about how we can be transformative in terms of changing and improving the opportunities for young people. But it's got to be evidence-based. We've got to look as to what is going to have the biggest positive impact on children's lives. That's the approach that we're taking, and that's what we're looking at, how we can improve the outcomes for children.
So it sounds like you're thinking about permanent, transformative, in your words, change. When is that review going to be announced? When will we know what you're going to do?
Well, it's a whole series of different changes. The first step of those changes were what we announced just the other week, where we set out our plans for catch-up, whether it's the expansion of small group tutoring for children from the most disadvantaged
that's going
background.
on into helping children catch up. What do we know? What's the time frame of it? I mean, could it be in place for this summer holiday?
Well, what we've done is we've asked Sir Kevin to look over a period of 18 months. What we're going to be doing as a department, as a government, is looking at a whole series of options and changes. But there are going to be, it's not just all going to be in one day when it's all announced. There's going to be a whole series of actions that we are going to undertake to improve the life chances, to improve the education of children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, but actually all children. How can we do the absolute most for every single one of them, to ensure that they do so much, get the very best out of themselves and get the very best out of their education?
OK, I want to talk now about exams. You've obviously cancelled exams as we know it for this year. You said that teachers can effectively decide on the grades that the pupils should get. And they can do this basically however they want. They can use mini tests, they can look at old exams, they can write their own tests. They can be done under exam conditions, they can be done under Zoom, they can be done at home, they can look at coursework, they can look at classwork. I mean, how on earth can you expect exam results to be fair and consistent in these conditions?
Well, Sophie, we'd always start off on the basis of the best form of assessment would be through examination. Of course, that's the most consistent way of being able to assess children. But we haven't been in that position to be able to do that this year. So we've had to look at alternative models. This is why we've set out a very clear structure for teachers, building scaffolding and guidance around that so they understand as to what grades should be awarded for individual pupils, making sure, and the teachers I speak to, really are approaching this in the most professional of manners and ways, recognising how important it is, using that guidance. But then on top of that, there's going to be both internal inspection and quality assurance within the school. But additional to that is the external quality assurance that will be coming from the exam boards. This is in the process of randomised testing, in terms of randomised audits of schools right across the country to make sure they've been following the guidance and the grades as they've been awarding are a fair assessment.
How many schools or results will they be looking at then, just to put it in context? And
on top of that, if I can just add on top of that, is where there are outliers, where schools are submitted grades that do not seem to be consistent with what they've always been able to achieve in the past. Any of those outliers, exam boards will be able to look at those incredibly closely and actually work with the schools to make sure there is the right assessment. That's something that is going to be going right across the country, and there is going to be, that large-scale randomised sampling. But additional to that,
what is large scale then? What is large scale randomised sampling? Like, how many samples are you going to look at?
Well, we're going to be looking extensively across all school settings, whether it's private schools, whether it's state
But how
schools,
many?
and
How many?
and it will be many, many thousands that will be sort of looked at in terms of part of that process.
Many, many thousands of schools or grades or what?
Across schools, exam centres.
OK, because, I mean, I guess many would worry you're putting teachers in a bit of an impossible position here. You've got randomised exams, you've got internal assessments, but many teachers will know that there, of course, will be an incentive to actually inflate grades, to err on the side of generosity. And if they don't, and their peers do in other schools or in other classes, then they could be putting their pupils at a disadvantage for life.
Well, so, Sophie, I think that our whole teaching profession approaches this with the most serious sort of professional approach, and what you would expect and what you would want of teachers. And as teachers go into this process, they're going to be following the guidelines very, very closely. They're going to be looking at what the exam boards have issued, the grade descriptors of saying this is what a child is meant to have achieved if they're to be given an A, a B or a C at A level, or a 9876 in GCSE. So they're going to be looking at that exceptionally closely. There's a whole process of internal quality assurance that has to go on within the school. But on top of that, that's at the overlaying all that is the quality assurance that's going to be there by the exam boards, looking at where there is potential malpractice and making sure they come down on that. But, you know, of course, any form of assessment is never going to be as good as exams. That's why we're so committed to moving forward with exams if that had been possible. But that's not going to be feasible this year. And actually, if you've seen the response, you know, the consultation we ran, that was over 100,000 people took part in it. And the response from those professional teaching organisations, they recognise that while this is a challenge for teachers, it is without a doubt the fairest and the best approach that we can possibly take in unusual circumstances. Now,
I'm sure you'd admit it's been a pretty difficult year. We've had the exam fiasco, the algorithm fiasco of last summer. Children went back to school for one day in January only to be sent home again. Then, of course, according to the Education and Endowment Foundation, a decade of progress closing that gap between privileged pupils and more disadvantaged, potentially lost. Do you think you've done a good job?
Well, my focus, Sophie, is always about trying to deliver the very best for children, whether that's for £1.7 billion catch-up money that we're delivering into schools, for the launch of a tutoring programme that supports and targets for children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, the fact that we've launched a radical reform of post-16 education, making sure that children are best able to succeed in whatever route they go down. And my commitment, my absolute commitment, by making sure that children are back in school at the earliest opportunity. That's what my focus is, and making sure that children are back in school on Monday, tomorrow, and making sure they're in the position to be able to enjoy their education and really benefit from it. So that's my focus. I'll leave others to do the commentary.
OK. I'm just looking at the Cabinet approval ratings, the latest Cabinet approval ratings as voted for by Conservative Party members. Now, they're a pretty generous lot. Liz Truss is on plus 86, Rishi Sunak on plus 74, Priti Patel, who broke the ministerial code, is on plus 50. There's only two people in minus territory. There's Amanda Milling on minus 4.5, and then there's you on minus 43.6. It's not great, is it?
Well, Sophie, my focus is on one thing: getting our children back into school tomorrow, making sure that children get the benefit from education. And I think that's what people right across the country want to know, that our focus, the whole government's focus, is on in terms of delivering the education that we want all of our children to benefit from. So you're very much talking about, a Westminster story. What I think our nation's parents and our nation's children want to know is that they're going back to school tomorrow. They're going to have the benefit of a world-class education. That's what we're focused on delivering on.
Have you ever wondered if, part of the reason that you're in the job still is because you're really acting as a bit of a firewall for Boris Johnson? You're soaking up a lot of flack from the issues in education over the last year and protecting the Prime Minister.
Well, the Prime Minister and myself have a shared passion, this belief that we can transform education, transform the life chances of everyone. All the way through this pandemic, we have highlighted the consistent fact that education is our national priority, that schools would be the last things to close and the first things to open. And that's what we said, and that's what we're actually delivering on. So the Prime Minister and myself have that shared passion, that shared commitment for our schools, and most importantly for our children. That is where we're completely and utterly united on. And, as I say, it's very much a shared passion. That's what we're delivering on. That's why we've been putting the extra investment in terms of catch-up, helping children, not just those children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, but children from all backgrounds, best be able to get the best out of their school life.
OK, and as you say, the good news, certainly, to see all those pupils return to the classroom from tomorrow. Gavin Williamson, thank you very much for being on the programme. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Education Secretary Gavin Williamson there. Well, let's stick with that theme of schools ahead of the big return to the classroom tomorrow. And we're joined by the Ofsted Chief Inspector, Spellman. Thank you very much for being on the programme. I just want to start with what you've written in The Sun on Sunday today, saying it's great the school gates will be thrown open next week, but we know the school experience won't be normal for some time yet. Testing, face masks. Do you think that pupils and parents are really ready for some of the logistical challenges?
I think the vast majority are. They had a bit of a taster of this last term. I think what we can see about the proportion of parents who are expecting to have their children back in school the first possible day shows that people can cope.
Do you think that children are going to be prepared, I guess, for wearing face masks, not just in communal areas like corridors, but all day in the classroom?
Children are adaptable and flexible. I think the overwhelming thing we're seeing is that the vast majority of parents, the vast majority of children, the vast majority of teachers are really happy to be going back to school. I think they can live with a little bit of inconvenience for a few weeks. I really hope that the whole paraphernalia of masks and testing isn't only necessary for a short time. I think we've got some reasons to be optimistic from what we can see. But let's make sure that children get the pleasure of learning, the pleasure of socialising, the pleasure of all those wider activities they get when they're at school.
I was talking to Gavin Williamson a bit about what happens if children just don't wear face masks. Do you think that they need to be enforced in the classroom, or do you think that the current approach is the right one?
Face masks testing, this is part of a system of infection control that's not designed or expected to eliminate any infection ever happening. It's designed to reduce it to levels that shouldn't cause anybody anxiety. So, of course, there are always going to be a small proportion of children and of adults who can't wear face masks. But we shouldn't let anxieties about a tiny proportion stop us recognising the overall goal here.
It's interesting as well to hear you talk about how you hope that this will be for a limited amount of time. What kind of period are you hoping that it will last for before some of these measures can be eased?
Well, I think we've been told that the face mask guidance will be reviewed at Easter, I think. So I love the idea of children being able to come back in the summer term, able to see everybody fully.
OK. Now, Ofsted, of course, began inspecting schools again in January. Checks had previously been suspended because of COVID. What kind of things are your inspections finding?
Well, we've reported through the autumn, we did interim visits that weren't judgment visits, and we're doing monitoring visits now. What we've seen this term has shown the extraordinary efforts that schools have been putting into remote education. It's been very hard work for teachers. And of course, as we know, nothing like as rewarding on the receiving end. So it's one of the reasons why we should all be very happy about getting back to school. But schools have been thinking about what it is the minimum curriculum they want to make sure that children get even when they're working remotely. A lot of effort has gone into making sure that almost all children are able to reach the curriculum through one kind of device or another. But it has been a slog. It's been a real slog. Children at the receiving end are bored, lonely, miserable, anxious, and really, really want the normal experience again.
Yeah, you can definitely see slog is probably the right word there. How worried are you about the mental health aspect of this as well? You know, we talk an awful lot about academic achievement, about exams, about catch-up and progress, but it does strike me that, you know, it's been very hard for young people mentally, from a mental health perspective, all this time at home, cut off from their friends, staring at a computer.
It has been very hard. And I just said that lonely, bored, miserable, that's very, very common. But I think the good news is that for the vast majority of children, the restoration of normality, everyday experience of the sense of learning, being with friends, being with teachers, getting to play football or whatever it might happen to be again, that of itself for most children will be enough to lift those symptoms, to get them back into being the children they were before and will be again. But there is a minority. Let's hope it's not too large a minority whose problems have increased, and it's really important that we're good at recognising where problems are arising. Things like eating disorders, things like self-harm. I know that mental health services are very aware of the kinds of problems that have been increasing and where they can expect more cases coming through. So everybody needs to be alert to these.
The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, was pretty clear that changes to the school holidays are on the table, that they could be looking at a 5-term year potentially, or shortening the summer holiday. That's one of the things that this review is looking into. You've written today saying making school days longer or school holidays shorter could backfire. Why do you think it could backfire?
Well, first of all, I really want to make sure that all children do get their full ration of schooling. We don't want children to lose out in the long term. They've been postponed to the interests of the old and the sick while we've dealt with coronavirus, but children really matter and their lives matter. In terms of adjustments to school days and school years, many experiments have happened in the past. I think one of the really important things is to learn from the experiments that have happened in the past, because, of course, there's no point adding time here or moving time there if you don't get a groundswell of support. If children simply don't turn up for extra time or summer schools, for example, you could end up putting a lot of effort into something that doesn't achieve the objective. So my concern is to make sure that we go with the grain of what parents will embrace to make sure that all children get the very most out of their education.
You talk about what experiments have shown previously. What have they shown with regards to holidays?
I think a number of schools have experimented over the last couple of decades with things like 5-term years. I don't think many of those have persisted. I don't know the reasons why, but I think it's really important to learn if people are proposing to redesign, to make sure that people understand why they haven't been a long-standing success in the past, and make sure they're designed in ways that people really will throw themselves into supporting.
Okay. On social media, quite a few people have contacted me with very different experiences of homeschooling, of the kind of lessons that their classes are providing, of the sort of teacher support that they're giving. Obviously, this is anecdotal, but what has your inspection shown in terms of whether or not there is consistency about the amount of support schools have provided over lockdown?
Last summer, when there weren't explicit requirements for schools, it was clear that there was enormous variability in the experience that children were getting. I think what our monitoring visits this term have shown is that we're getting much closer to consistency in that there are clear minimum expectations of quite significant input, and that the vast majority of schools are putting that effort in, and the vast majority of children are receiving that. Having said which, there will always be corners where there are problems. I'm not saying that every child in the country has had the full experience they should, but compared with last year, it's a very, very much better picture. But it is still tiring, exhausting, draining for everybody. I think if there's one thing we've learned, it's quite how important schools, actual schools, physical schools, are for adults and for children.
Yeah, I think that's certainly something that parents and pupils wouldn't disagree with you with. Just finally, and I know this isn't strictly your brief, but I just want to get your thoughts on exams. Do you think that having teachers effectively deciding exam results is the right way to go?
There is no perfect solution this year. We have a system that's designed for normal years when all children have had more or less the same access to education. This year, for obvious reasons, it's been very unequal across the country between schools. So there was a groundswell of opinion that said it wouldn't be fair simply to run exams as normal, because the results would recognise that would be as much about that inequality in access as they would about how well children have done with what they have been taught or what potential they've got for progression. So we've got a sort of hybrid here, which is, I think is a good attempt at creating the best we can do in very, very unsatisfactory circumstances. I think what we need to do is have everybody embrace it and do as much as we can to make it work.
OK. Amanda Spellman, thank you so much for being on the programme this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, tomorrow marks International Women's Day. Coronavirus have, of course, affected everyone in so many ways, but there have been some issues that have hit women particularly hard, whether it's on childcare, job prospects or domestic abuse. Yesterday, I spoke to the Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, and I asked her whether things have improved or got worse for women around the world in the last year.
Well, we unfortunately have been hard hit by the pandemic. And some of the gains that we made in the last 2 decades especially are under significant threats. During the pandemic, women have lost most of the jobs, about 2/3 of the jobs that were lost were jobs that belonged to women. And this is because women tend to be at the lower end with jobs that are not protected, with jobs that do not have enforceable contracts, and in some countries are not even covered by the labor laws. So it's very easy to get rid of women in times of crisis. We've seen girls dropping out of school in larger numbers. Again, this is one area where we've been making progress in the last 2 decades. But also women's leadership is not being taken as seriously as we need to be taking it serious. And we've seen now, even during this crisis, that in the task teams and committees that are dealing with COVID, women are underrepresented. In 87 countries that we surveyed, only about 3.6 have gender equal, a representation of men and women. And you can't have men fixing the issues that affect women most.
It's interesting you're talking there about women in leadership throughout the pandemic, because in countries where we've had women leaders, there's actually been quite a lot of praise for how they've dealt with it in places like New Zealand and Germany, for instance.
Absolutely. And this year's theme for International Women's Day is on women's leadership. There is an opportunity here at the back of this pandemic to actually promote women's leadership. And we have this evidence of women who have performed very well and have managed the pandemic in an impressive way.
You talked about women in the workplace and the impact it's had. And of course, in the UK, it's also had a big impact on how women are doing in the workplace, the pandemic. So, for example, 17% of mothers in the UK said they've had to give up on work during the pandemic. Mothers on the lowest incomes 9 times more likely to have lost their jobs. Do you worry that even in places like the UK and wealthy nations, that the pandemic could set back women's progress potentially decades?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just for women slipping out of the labour market is a big issue. And in countries like the UK, where women did achieve much better representation in the labour market, it is going to cost us a lot to have those women now not earning and not being able to be as independent as they were as working mothers, working women.
Another aspect that we've seen in the UK is in domestic violence, the number of people reporting domestic violence. The UN's described it as a shadow pandemic. How concerned are you that as we're told to stay at home, it's actually not a safe place for so many women?
We have called this increase of gender-based violence a pandemic of its own, a shadow pandemic that has existed before there was COVID-19 and will continue to exist after COVID-19. So we need to fight it, not just for what is happening now during the pandemic, but fight it for the future as well, and deal with it as a pandemic with all hands on deck. In the context of gender-based violence, our frontline workers are social workers, the police, civil society, the judiciary, all of those would need to make decisions that will prevent the violence from happening, as well as prosecute In some countries, the increase has been as high as 40%.
I'm also interested as well if you're worried about increased nationalism, so countries effectively looking to protect themselves because they're dealing with the crisis of COVID rather than reaching out and trying to help people in other countries. So in the UK, for example, we've reduced the aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5% of GDP. We've cut aid to Yemen. How much of a concern is this for the UN?
It really is concerning us, and we are appealing for countries to be generous at this time of need. Solidarity in a time like this is actually important because in the fight against the pandemic, safety in one country when there is no safety in another country is not real safety. We need to fight the pandemic all over the world and to help each other, because we will not be able to be safer if one part of the world is not safe. The same thing about driving countries into extreme poverty. We know that when people are desperate, they will move around the world. So the people that you are leaving exposed to extreme poverty will show up on your doorstep at some point. So we have to be in this all together. We are also concerned about women who are refugees and migrants and people who are refugees and migrants, because COVID has tended to push people out of countries that are hosting them back to their own countries, where sometimes they do not have the infrastructure to survive in their own countries because they already migrated to a new countries. And sometimes they don't have the papers to be moving back and forth. So migrants are finding themselves in very difficult situations. We're also concerned about equitable distribution of vaccine, because there is a danger also that women in some situations will not be given first preference for accessing the vaccine. If we know about the preference for boys, the preference for men could easily be in front of the line, claiming that they are the ones who are maybe going out to work, confining women in the home space, which comes with its own complications. So we want governments to pay attention to equitable distribution of the vaccine and make sure that women are not discriminated against.
Just finally, when I was researching the interview, I was just very struck by your own sort of background. Growing up in South Africa, a teacher, becoming South Africa's first female deputy president, also having 5 children. It's a pretty impressive CV. What is it about your own experience growing up and becoming a woman that really sort of drove you and has inspired you?
You know, I grew up in South Africa at a time of apartheid. So you were thrust into activism because of the situation of the country. I also had a mother who was an activist in her own right. So there was a push from the home front, but also as a student, my friends and fellow students were activists in the main. And in fact, for people of my age group, if you were not an activist, you really were somehow on the wrong track, because everything pointed you in a direction that called on you to take action about what was happening in the country. It was much easier to be an activist than to fold your hands.
That's very interesting. And thank you so much for being on the programme today and talking a bit about International Women's Day. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Executive Director of UN Women there, ahead of International Women's Day. Well, we're going to talk about that with our next guest, but there's a lot of other things to discuss too. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, joins us now from Wigan. Thank you so much for being on the programme this morning. I just want to start with the budget. One of the most significant things to come out of the budget was this freeze in income tax levels. Now, I was kind of under the impression that Labour supported that, but I read in The Observer that you're going to vote against it. Can you clear up what is Labour's position?
We are going to vote against it this week. We think that now is absolutely the wrong time to be targeting low and middle income earning families for tax hikes and squeezing their incomes, not least because if you do that, it means that they're not going out and spending on the high streets, and the economy, the recovery is very fragile at the moment. We were really concerned when those plans were announced that what the government was effectively saying was that low and middle income earning families would be targeted to start paying into the system a full year before many of those major corporations, because the corporation tax rise doesn't come in until a year later. The Shadow Chancellor pushed the Chancellor on that at the dispatch box. We couldn't get a satisfactory answer. We think this is the wrong thing to do, so we'll be voting against it this week.
You say that the Shadow Chancellor pushed on this, but at the same time it does feel like it's been a bit of a change of heart. You didn't oppose it earlier in the week, and the Shadow Chancellor told my colleague Kate McCann on Wednesday it would have been the wrong decision to do it now, but more sensible to take these measures in the future. I mean, it is a year in the future. It feels like there's been a change of policy here. Is that a bit opportunistic?
No, we've been absolutely consistent about this, that we don't want to see low and middle income earning families paying the price for this pandemic.
But just to come in here, just to come in, if I may, because you've made the point on low and middle income earners a few times, and yes, I accept that it will impact them, but it does affect higher rate taxpayers more, doesn't it? It's not targeted at lower incomes.
It does, but we've been consistent in saying that the recovery is very fragile. There are businesses in this country, including many in my constituency here in Wigan, that just haven't been open for most of the last year because we've been in almost permanent lockdown in parts of the north of England. And what they most need to see is families going out and spending again when we start to unlock. They're looking forward to that. They think they can survive if we do that. But if you start to target those families too quickly, what you'll see then is the recovery choked off before it's even begun. We're also very concerned about the fact that buried in the small print of this budget was a council tax rise for those families. We're going to see cuts to universal credit coming in 6 months. What you're hitting families with is a perfect storm where their incomes are going to be squeezed from multiple directions, and we just think that that is the wrong thing to do. It's the wrong thing to do for those families, but it's also the wrong thing to do for the economy.
Just wonder if it sounds to some like a bit of a cake and eat it approach. You're voting against tax rises. You want to see more public spending on things like nurses' pay, for example, because you're also, of course, saying that the government's planned 1% pay rise for nurses isn't enough. What do you want to see?
Well, I don't think this is a have your cake and eat it approach. I think this is entirely in step with most major economies. If you look over at the United States, Joe Biden is putting in a fiscal stimulus package worth trillions. The European Union is following suit. I think there is an economic consensus that the way in which we're going to get through this is to make sure that we protect businesses and workers right now. And actually, there was an argument about that in the Conservative Party, but ultimately that is an argument that the Chancellor accepted by delaying corporation tax rises in this budget. We want to see money going into the pockets of low earners, hard-working low earners, including low and middle earners in the National Health Service, who deserve it, who've got us through this crisis, who've gone out and worked every single day, were promised a pay rise and should get, at the very least, what they were promised. That is the way that you get the economy moving again. We saw that in 2010 when we had a huge deep cuts to the public sector. It took money out of the pockets of working people and it choked off any prospects of recovery in towns like mine. We cannot afford to keep making these mistakes again.
The question was about nurses' pay. You say that the government's planned a 1% pay rise isn't enough. What pay rise do you want to see?
Well, the government, to be clear, is not planning a pay rise. Buried in the small print of this budget was not only that but
what do you want to see? I'm just trying to work out. What's Labour calling for.
Yeah, I'm just making the point that that is a real terms pay cut because it doesn't keep pace with inflation, and for nurses to be offered a pay cut is just reprehensible in our view. In the NHS long-term plan, the government budgeted for a 2.1% pay rise. That is what nurses were promised, and last year they legislated for that in order to give nurses a cast iron guarantee that after years and years of seeing their real terms pay fall, that the government would finally reverse that situation and start to see their pay increase. We think they ought to go into these negotiations at a bare minimum, honouring that promise of 2.1%, and then considering what more they can offer to our NHS staff who have done so much to put their families and themselves at risk every day going into work. Some of them have died. What can they offer to our NHS workforce who've done so much for us?
So what are you calling
over and
for,
above
though?
that 2.1%?
What do you
But we
know,
think at the very minimum, they must honour that commitment that they wrote into law at 2.1%. And then there is a process ongoing where a pay review body rightly looks at this independently of government. They will make recommendations to government, but we think nurses deserve a pay rise this year, and that should never have been something that was up for negotiation. This is a government that's completely got its priorities wrong. If they can give a special advisor who broke the rules a 50% pay rise, but then offer our nurses a real terms pay cut, that is a government that just has not understood who it is that is getting us through this crisis and who deserves to be fairly rewarded.
The Royal College of Nursing says it's preparing for possible strike action. Would you support nurses striking?
Well, look, I'll always support nurses. I've always supported NHS staff since I was elected 11 years ago. But nurses in my constituency who I met last week are not asking me for a strike. They weren't promised a strike. They were promised a pay rise. And that is what I'm determined that they're going to get. A pay rise and the resources for the National Health Service that last year the Chancellor said would absolutely categorically be delivered. He said we will give the NHS whatever it takes. And instead, buried in the small print of this budget was an £8 billion cut for the NHS. They were promised a pay rise. They were promised resources for the National Health Service, and that is what I'm determined to stand shoulder to shoulder with our nursing staff in order to make sure that the government delivers.
OK, now children, of course, returning to the classroom tomorrow. Big news for pupils, teachers and parents, of course. In secondary schools, teachers and pupils are going to be told that they should wear face masks unless they're exempt. It's non-binding guidance, though. Does Labour think it should be a legal obligation?
I think all the way through this health crisis, when we've met with SAGE scientists and had regular briefings, they've been absolutely clear that you can't enforce public health. You have to carry people with you. And I think going down a route of enforcing, compelling students to take actions is probably not the right approach. It's not the right approach for students, for parents, and many teachers in my constituency have been telling me that they feel that that would be unenforceable. I think what we really need to see is a wider plan of action to help people comply with the measures. On testing, for example, there are a number of parents who are very worried about their children being tested. One of the reasons for that is because many parents can't afford to self-isolate at the moment if their child's test comes back positive. So we've been pushing the government to extend the self-isolation payment. 70% of people who apply for it are rejected, and that's why one of the reasons why only 3 in 10 people are actually doing it. So I think there are other measures that we could take rather than trying to force teachers to go around policing mask wearing and other measures in schools that would actually be far more effective.
Now, I'm keen to ask about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe as well, the British mother in jail in Iran. Now, her sentence is due to come to an end today, but her husband, Richard, basically said he doesn't know what's going to happen. Do you have any intelligence on what is likely to happen to Nazanin and what should be done?
I don't. It's been frustratingly slow in relation to progress on this issue. And when I met with Richard Ratcliffe recently, it was clear how difficult this process has been. The family are very keen to continue to have the support of the Foreign Office, but I think I can say, frankly, that there just hasn't been enough focus and enough effort, not just on Nazanin's case, which is heartbreaking, but also on the other British dual Iranian nationals who are currently being held in Iran. We need to see much more progress on this. When I meet this family, I just feel that there's not much more that they can take of this, to be honest. And other countries have made more progress in getting their nationals home. We need to see a really concerted effort now across government, led by the Prime Minister, to make up for some of the mistakes that he's made in the past and to make sure that we get Nazanin home and other dual nationals home as well. OK, now, of course, it's International Women's Day tomorrow, and it does feel, if you look at the data, that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on
Women, particularly mothers, 17% of mothers have had to give up on work during the pandemic, 72% have cut their hours. Mothers on the lowest incomes, 9 times more at risk of losing their jobs. Are you worried that the pandemic could set back women's progress in the workplace, potentially by years, decades?
I am worried about it. One of the things that we've seen over the course of this pandemic is a rise in working from home. That's obviously had a huge effect on people's ability to deal with caring responsibilities, not just childcare, but care for elderly parents as well. But there is a gap between the numbers of women who intend to return full-time to the workplace if they get the choice and the numbers of men who do. And there is a concern that that could continue to widen those inequalities. You know, the people who are in the workplace, far more visible, far more likely to be making decisions, far more likely to be promoted. So I think there's a risk that as we come out of this, we could see those inequalities that have widened already during the pandemic widen even further. I'm particularly concerned that women lack an obvious champion within government and that these issues that often end up being invisible as a consequence. I was listening to your last interview with real interest. It's fairly obvious that the more women you have at the highest levels making these decisions, the less likely it is that women become an afterthought in decisions that are made. So I think this is something that the government absolutely does need to take seriously and start to address.
Talking about having women in leadership roles, it's 2021. Labour still hasn't had a female leader. I know you ran yourself, but not only that, but when Labour members have gone, you did try, to be fair. But when Labour members have gone to vote in the ballot for their preferred candidate, a woman hasn't even placed above a man. I mean, that's pretty depressing, isn't it?
I think it is frustrating for Labour, and I won't dress that up. I found it particularly frustrating in the leadership contest to hear, you know, some of the things that women often hear when they're putting themselves forward for leadership positions. You haven't got the experience, it's not your turn. There were, you know, you don't look like a Prime Minister. I wasn't the only person to hear those. I think Becky Long-Bailey heard quite a bit of that, and so did the other candidates who weren't men. That is really frustrating. That's something that I'm absolutely committed that we're going to start to turn around and change. But I have to say that, you know, since that leadership contest, working with Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, I know that's something they're absolutely committed to. We've got our first ever shadow female Chancellor of the Exchequer. I'm the first BAME woman to ever hold the post of Shadow Foreign Secretary. You know, if you look at Labour's top team, we've got women in those key positions. And I just hope that by being in those positions and by standing up and providing a strong challenge to the government and an alternative about how to bring Britain forwards, that we are showing the way that women can be in those leadership roles, and that, you know, ultimately that will change and that we will have a female leader at some point in the future. Not yet, I should hasten to add. But,
not going to run again, just in case Keir Starmer's watching.
Just to clarify, but it is important actually that women are in those roles. When I was growing up, there were women in leadership roles, people like Tessa Jowell, who went on to become a mentor of mine. I cannot tell you how much those women matter in those leadership roles. You know, people like Diane Abbott as well, really strong women who broke the mould and blazed a trail. It really matters, and I'm absolutely determined that our generation is not going to drop the ball on this, that we're going to keep seeing progress.
I remember during that Labour leadership contest, you said at one point that you'd quite like to see Queen Meghan. I just wonder how you're feeling about some of the coverage of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. You're going to be watching the Oprah Winfrey interview.
I feel like I absolutely jinxed that. I should probably never have said it, because things have only got worse for the royal family since then. And I have to say that, my heart does go out to everybody involved in this. It's difficult being in the public eye. It's particularly difficult when your family is dragged into this. And what I see when I look at the royal family is a family going through a very difficult time. All of it being played out in public with maximum publicity. I think it would be far better for them if they were able to deal with this privately behind the scenes. And to be honest, I think it would be better for the country as well. They're having a very hard time, but so are hundreds of thousands of families in this country at the moment because of COVID. I think that they're the families that we ought to be focusing on.
OK, Lisa, Nandy, thank you so much for being on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, it's been a very busy week, but few stories were more significant than Nicola Sturgeon giving evidence to the inquiry that's investigating the Scottish Government's handling of sexual harassment allegations against former First Minister Alex Salmond. Now, the government was found to have acted unlawfully. Mr Salmond was cleared of the charges in court. Nicola Sturgeon avoided any major damage in her marathon evidence session on Wednesday, but she is still under pressure, with critics alleging she broke the ministerial code. Now, that could be a resigning matter. And a new poll for the Scotland on Sunday newspaper today, the first since the First Minister's appearance before the inquiry, suggests the row could be hurting the Scottish independent movement. Now, the polls found that support for independence has dropped to 48%, with 52% now saying they would vote no in a second referendum. And of course, the Salmond inquiry is the main issue driving support for the union, with more than a third of people citing it as their primary reason. 43% of people say they trust Nicola Sturgeon less now due to the inquiry. 26% say they trust her more. 25% say their view is unchanged. And meanwhile, 46% of respondents say they trust the Scottish Government less due to that inquiry. Well, let's talk more about this. We're joined by the SNP's Mhairi Black. Thank you very much for being with us. We've just seen the details of the first poll since Nicola Sturgeon's evidence. Are you concerned that this is now starting to damage support for independence?
Well, I mean, I think that's been in the back of the minds of any SNP supporter for a long time now. But I think the important point is that these polls just give a snapshot, and this particular poll isn't comparable to previous polls, so I would take it with a pinch of caution. But ultimately, it goes to show that we cannot take anything for granted, you know. And one of the things that I actually have always liked about the SNP is that we've been very upfront in saying that it is on us to convince people of the case for independence. So it just shows that we still have work to do.
And I take your point that I think it's right that it hasn't been weighted for turnout, for example, this poll, so not necessarily directly comparable. But you do acknowledge that there are concerns within the SNP that what we've seen play out between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond could have damaged that support.
Well, I think that the conflict within any political party can often lead to damaging. It's certainly damaging the reputation and the look of the party, but I don't think that that's necessarily what is happening just now. And it touches more broadly on this harassment inquiry in general. And I think a lot of people are almost trying to force agendas onto these issues. And the real issue at the heart of all of these, the things that we're talking about, is the women that, you know, were complaining, the complainants. And ultimately, as politicians, I think we have to ask ourselves that throughout this saga, have we made it easier or more difficult for people to come forward? And I think that's what the focus should be, rather than, you know, internal party politics as such.
And what do you think the answer to that question is?
To the question of
whether it's easier for women to come forward?
Oh, I wouldn't say so, no. I think the way that this inquiry has played out has just been horrendous. And I can't imagine the horror of the experience that the complainants are having just now. And there's a couple of things to make clear. The first thing is the Scottish Government did make a mistake in terms of how they actually implemented this policy. And it's actually quite refreshing, I think, to see the First Minister in particular put her hands up and sincerely say, yeah, no, we could do better. And that's what the point of this inquiry should be, is to figure out how can we make sure that this kind of mistake never happens again. And instead what we've had is just this barrage of conspiracy theories, of attacks on our institutions, of clear political agendas taking precedence over what is a very serious issue.
OK, I mean, you say that the Scottish Government has admitted mistakes, that it's refreshing that Nicola Sturgeon has held her hands up, but no one's resigned, have they? Is that really taking responsibility?
Yeah, I appreciate your point. And in terms of resignations and things, I think it's important to remember that the committee inquiry has still to be published. So, I think it would be a bit presumptuous to start, sacking people right now.
But you've just said the government let people down, though.
Would
that not be the right thing to do, to take responsibility?
Yes, but I think that it's important that we figure out where that responsibility actually lies. And in terms of the implication that this somehow lies with the First Minister, I would say that's where we know that there is a current inquiry being undertaken by James Hamilton, which the FM actually referred herself to for further scrutiny on top of the committee inquiry. So I can't help but notice the double standards as well here, because, when we talk about these issues, we've heard the Scottish Conservatives in particular, for instance, they put out a press release before the First Minister had even given evidence to the committee calling for her to resign. And that's just ludicrous and shows what the real agenda is there. But in comparison, a court has shown that Boris Johnson has misled Parliament, and yet I'm not seeing any 8 hours questioning sessions for him or seeing him submit himself to the kind of scrutiny that the FM is.
It's not about Boris Johnson, though, is it? What we're talking about here specifically is what is happening in Scotland. We're talking about Nicola Sturgeon as well. Just looking at the ministerial code, it's quite clear. The Scottish Government's ministerial code says legal advice should be considered at the earliest opportunity. Now, on the 31st of October 2018, the government's own lawyers said its argument in the case against Alex Salmond was more likely to fail than succeed. On the 6th of December, they said that the least worst option was to concede the case. So why did it take until 8th of January the following year for that to happen?
Well, I mean, there's, again, a few different things to consider here. What has been published so far and what the FM made clear was that there are continually different legal opinions throughout a process. And what the government were advised is, look, that we are now starting to see cause for concern in our case. However, we think that the legal grounds themselves are sufficient enough to keep pushing this. So it kind of comes down to, in my view, the semantics and the details of the institutions and the law themselves. So I think it's important to let due process take its place. So, but the FM's been very clear that the moment that it was made clear to her that the case there was no point in pursuing it,
How can you say that, though, that the moment she thought that the case wasn't going to be there, when on the 31st of October, the government's own lawyers said the case was more likely to fail than succeed, 6th of December, the least worst option was to concede the case, and yet you didn't do anything till the 8th of January? I mean, it doesn't really sound that way, does it?
Well, no, there's also a couple of things to consider, because legal advice is made up of different sources, so there's a lot of different things to consider. In the October letter that you're referencing, my understanding is that there was still grounds for it to be pursued in court, because the distinction that I think was important that the FM made is that where the flaw was in this process was in how we implemented the policy. The actual policy itself remains intact, it remains in effect and currently untested. So I know it's a slight point, but I think it's an important one.
So the ministerial code may have been broken, according to critics. The government has acknowledged it acted unlawfully. You yourself say that the complainants have been let down. Over £500,000 of taxpayers' money has been lost. At some point, does someone need to resign for this?
Again, I think it's important that we let inquiries take their process. I think it would be inappropriate for me to, be making assumptions on that we have these.
But these things aren't assumptions. I'm talking about things that have happened.
In what sense? We don't know that
acting
the ministerial
unlawfully
code has been broken.
The money.
The FM's been very clear that
women have been let down, as you said.
Yes, no. The fact that women have been let down completely, and I think that's again my first point is where the committee inquiry, I think its focus should be looking at, right, well, what is it that went wrong? And my understanding is that it was to do with prior communication with complainants, that was the issue around the actual implementation of the policy. But like I say, are we making it easier or more difficult for people to come forward? And I think when you consider how the women at the heart of this have actually been weaponised for different narratives, that has been the most upsetting thing for me to see. And of course, the government should face scrutiny, and I don't see any evidence to suggest that the government are trying to evade that scrutiny, but I think it's important to let processes play out.
The government should face scrutiny, but should the government also be held accountable?
Of course.
Does someone need to take responsibility and lose their job?
Well, of course, but you're asking me, should someone lose their job over something that we don't know the complete...
No, but I'm asking you whether they should with respect, whether they should lose their job over things that we do know. The government's acted unlawfully.
Right,
Women, as you said, have been let down. £500,000 worth of taxpayers' money lost. These are things that we know.
No, completely, I understand that, but who is it in particular that you're thinking that you're asking me whether they should resign?
Well, either the First Minister or who else you think that was responsible for the mistakes that the government made?
Well, like I say, these reviews are currently in motion just now to identify what went wrong and where it went wrong. And actually, one of the things that has hampered that process is constantly having to rebut the wild conspiracy theories that have been touted by some.
OK. Now, tomorrow is International Women's Day, important day, of course. Women have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic in Scotland, but across the UK and also across the world as well. And whether you look at things like domestic abuse, childbirth, women in the workplace, are you worried about the impact that the pandemic's had on women's rights?
Yes, the impact that the pandemic has had on women in general. Sadly, the trend in most areas of politics seems to be that issues predominantly affect women much worse than they do others. And the fact that we know, as you alluded to earlier on in the programme, that single parents in particular have been really struggling during this period. It's undoubtedly been tough.
Yeah, I think certainly lots of people would agree with that. You've previously, of course, criticised Westminster for being a bit of a boys' club and for being a sexist institution. What has your experience been?
Exactly that, to be honest with you. I think Westminster in particular, it does. I think the people within it often have a view that it is some kind of private membership club. And it's very bizarre at times, in the manner in which I think people conduct themselves often is very macho, if not outright misogynistic at times. So yeah, I've certainly experienced it. But on the other hand, I have experienced an attempt to raise awareness about these issues and an attempt by Parliament to address some of these issues. So I do have to give credit where it's due. At least they're trying. Yeah,
definitely still worth trying. You're saying that you've sort of experienced or seen things that are misogynistic. What kind of things are you talking about?
Well, the one that always springs to mind was the first time that I was elected. I was sitting out on the terrace and there was a elder member, I'll say, who sat down with me. And I remember asking, when is it again the summer holidays are? And they leaned in and said, I think you'll find it's called recess, darling. And I had to reply, I think you'll find I'm called Mhairi, sweetheart. So, just daft things like that happen much more often than they should. And that begins to seep out into the narrative and how we talk about other issues. And I think that particularly when it comes to poverty and the pandemic, we are seeing that a lot of people in government and in Parliament in general don't quite get it. They're not seeing how it is impacting women disproportionately and why that matters and why we have to do something to address that.
Yeah, certainly something worth highlighting ahead of International Women's Day. Thank you so much for being on the programme, Mhairi Black there. Thank you. Well, that is it for the main show. Don't go anywhere, though. In just a moment, we'll be reviewing everything we've just heard in Sophy Ridge, The Take. And if you want even more analysis, you can check out the Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast. That's available from lunchtime in all the usual places. Stay where you are, because I'm going to be back after this short break.